الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, dear viewers, and welcome to another episode of this study room discussions where we simplify, summarize, or even comment on some of the most complex topics within the world of ulum al-Islamiyya, or better known as Islamic sciences. So in today's episode, we will be discussing some preliminary points about Usul-Hadith science in itself for students who are the early beginners of Usul Hadith. So if you are a student who is the first time who is studying Usul Hadith and you're an absolute beginner, then these major points that you need to remember and understand when it comes to Usul Hadith science in of itself. So there are about 6 to 7 points here that I'm going to summarize for you, and hopefully by once you understand these points and you embed these points further, then it'll give you a different perspective when you're studying Usul Hadith. So in any case, so there's a few points we need to understand when you're studying Usul Hadith. Number one is Hadith science itself is a very complex topic. What do we mean by this? Because the formative development of Hadith science, it concurred with the consolidation and the codification of Hadith manuals. Basically is that when Hadith was being compiled by the ulamas and the muhaddithin, then simultaneously the science of ilm al-rijal and the science of a criteria assessment and a critical assessment of the narrators, whether they need to be accepted or rejected. That science in of itself, it developed simultaneously, which then later on it developed as a separate discipline. So if somebody, or if you had a hadith scholar who was compiling his own hadith work, it was necessary for them to also master and understand the knowledge of ilm al-rijal, because in that ilm al-rijal, which roughly translates as the knowledge of men, which basically is a separate discipline and a science, that where the muhaddith, he does a critical assessment of the veracity and the reliability of each of the narrators in the chain, and based on those set criteria and conditions that which they follow, they would then determine whether this narrator, whether he's accepted or he's rejected. So it emerged as an essential supplementary discipline for assessing the credibility of the narrators and their reports. But scholars have written a plethora of work on this subject throughout generations, because refining the technical terms, the definitions, the categorization of authentic from non-authentic reports, stipulating certain conditions, what conditions are we going to follow, and comparing and contrasting different scholarly viewpoints. Because in this Usul Hadith science, you will notice that there are a lot of technical discussion, there are a lot of technical terms that are used. Those technical terms are defined, for example, then they're refined, and if there are differences in the definition, the Hadith scholars, they do mention that, depending on whichever book you're reading. So just to give you a typical example, that if you pick up the book of Ulum al-Hadith by Sheikh Nuruddin Itar rahimahullah, I think he's a Syrian scholar, and who's considered to be in the earliest contemporaries, in the master and expert in the field of hadith. If you read the first chapter of his book, for example, when he talks about the definition of hadith in of itself, he mentions difference of opinions. Just on the definition of a hadith in of itself, there are difference of opinions. And likewise, when he discusses the definition of sahih hadith, for example, and the criteria and the different categories of sahih hadith and likewise the da'if hadith, there are differences of opinions. So you see that ulamas and scholars, that even though they have generic criteria and generic conditions of a hadith, but when it comes to the details, they have difference of opinions. So you will encounter, most possibly, or your teacher may introduce you to difference of opinions, where you'll find the ulamas and scholars, like Sheikh Nuruddin Itar, for example, he compares and contrasts the scholarly viewpoints. And so being acquainted with those different viewpoints and those differences of opinion, it is essential, it is necessary for you to grasp the science in of itself. Because this is such a subject that you can't just over rely on just one or two scholars' opinion on a subject. Even if you do prefer following the opinion of one particular scholar, that does not mean that just by you relying on one scholar's opinion that you already have now fully grasped the science. So it depends that what's your goal in studying the subject. If you want to attain mastery in the subject, if you want to gain a deep understanding in the subject area, then it is necessary to study the subject from different viewpoints, So otherwise, by just overly relying on one or two scholars, it's like a person, and many people today nowadays, unfortunately, that they follow one particular scholar's opinion and viewpoint when it comes to hadith accreditation. So typically, you find somebody today that's saying that we follow Sahih Hadith, for example, a Da'if Hadith. And when you ask them who said is Sahih and Da'if, they say according to XYZ, according to this particular scholar, he's classed this Hadith as Sahih or he's classed this Hadith as Da'if, therefore we follow them. So it's like, so just sticking to one particular scholar in every single matter is like someone over relying on one specialist in the field and assuming that he has encompassed the entire genre of the subject. That's not the case, because each and every scholar, they're only presenting their perspective on a subject. And as a talib ilm, it's necessary to understand and to study the different viewpoints of on a particular subject, so we can gain a deeper and overview understanding of the subject matter in of itself. So the first thing to understand is that hadith science is a very complex topic. Um, and not a simple one. That's the first point. Number two, when it comes to hadith accreditation, which we call jarh ta'dil, hadith accreditation is an ijtihadic matter. It's not a definitive approach. There's always been a difference of opinions amongst the ulama and scholars, and this involves ijtihad. So despite the generic principles of hadith, so we know that when you're studying Usul-Hadith, the scholars will first begin by the discussion of the criteria, the generic criteria of accepting hadith. So they usually mention about 4 or 5, for example. For example, that there has to be adalat, there has to be kamil al-dabt, min ghayri illatin wala shadh, it has to be muttasil sanad, etc. So these are the generic principles, the generic conditions that all the scholars follow. But when it comes to the details, when it comes to the methodological criteria of accrediting and rejecting hadith, there is no one single or unanimous approach. So no single scholar, no matter how erudite he is, can never claim monopoly over the hadith accreditation. This is a key point to remember, that just because one particular scholar said that this is sahih, it does not mean that they claim monopoly over it. And now we have to consider this hadith as weak or weak authentic just because one particular scholar has said this. Okay. And by the way, one thing to understand is that the scholars of the past, the ulamas of the past, they never ever claimed a monopoly over the hadith. They just presented their work, they presented their conditions, and they left it for the later ulamas and scholars for them to either follow or to reject. So there's always been differences of viewpoints among the scholars in their criteria. So let me give you a few examples. Like, for example, the condition of liqa, for example. Liqa is a technical term which means meeting the actual teacher. So liqa, it comprises of meeting as well as suhbah, as well as being in the company of that particular teacher. So there's a question that when you have a student of hadith, when he's narrating a hadith from his teacher, then is it just sufficient for them to hear without staying in the company? So this has been a matter of difference of opinion. Some scholars, for example, have said that just by hearing the hadith, even passingly, as long as he's heard the hadith directly from the individual, from the Rabi, from the teacher, then that is sufficient, irrespective if he sat in his company or not. But as some scholars have said, that he has to remain for some time, for a certain amount of time in that teacher's company to ensure that the hadith that he has narrated, he has narrated it fully. That's one example. Another example is that when a student is narrating hadith from his teacher, is it necessary for them to memorize the wording of the hadith verbatim and narrate it verbatim exactly how their teacher had narrated it or not? Or is it permissible for a person to add a few words to the hadith or not? So this has been a matter of difference of opinions. Some scholars said that if he changes the wordings around, or if he doesn't narrate the hadith in exact verbatim as he heard it from his teachers, then we're not going to accept his narration. Some scholars have adopted a lenient approach and they said it is permissible. Likewise, for example, the narration of a mubtadi' fasik. So a mubtadi' is an innovator. An innovator, not to the degree of kufr, but to the degree of fisq. So he's an innovator, but he's still considered to be a Muslim. So can we accept his narration or not? This has been a matter of difference of opinions. And what if you had a mubtadi' or a fasiq, for example, who have now repented, sincerely repented from their bid'ah and repented from their sin? Can their narration be accepted after that? So after making tawbah, after seeking forgiveness, can their narration be accepted or not? Again, this has been a matter of difference of opinions. And likewise, the differences in the approach to resolving conflicting reports. So when we have conflicting reports, for example, when you have one hadith conflicting with the other, then how do you deal with that? Again, this is all a matter of difference of opinions. I don't have time doesn't permit us to go into the details, but just to give you some understanding that when it comes to the details of the criteria, there always been a matter of differences of opinion. So number two is that hadith accreditation is an ijtihadic approach. It's ijtihadic, it's not definitive. Point number three is the fiqh versus hadith approach. This is essential to understand, which means that understanding the fiqh and the hadith, fiqh of hadith vis-a-vis the sanad approach or to narration. You'll find the muhaddithin as well as the fuqahas, their approach to hadith is different. So the muhaddithin, for example, they primarily focus on the chain of narrations and the wordings of the text. 90%, 80 to 90% of the focus and the attention is on the chain of narrators as well as the wordings of the text. And the technical terms that are used, for example, you have mudabbaj, you have istirab, for example, you have idraj, for example, idraj sanad, for example, and you have maqlub, for example, these different technical terms, for instance, okay, right? They relate to the sanad as well as to the matan. Whereas the jurists or the fuqahas, on the other hand, they adopt a very comprehensive approach, a comprehensive approach, focusing their attention on either the textual meaning of the hadith, the interpretation of the hadith, the inference of rulings, the how do we do istinbat and how do we infer a ruling from this hadith, for example, as well as the chain of narration and the scholarly status of the companions' narrations. So this is another key thing that the fuqahas, they take into consideration the juristic status of the companion, So if, for example, typically, for example, this is generally the approach of the Ahnaf scholars, that if you have two conflicting reports, one Sahabi saying one thing, but the other Sahabi saying another. But yet, if you look at the companions, one companion's narration, one companion, he has a higher juristic status compared to the other, then they will prefer the companion who is included amongst the fuqaha, the sahabas. Why? Is because not only is he narrating the hadith, but he has a better understanding of the hadith, for example. So this is just one typical example. So number three is the fiqh versus hadith, the fuqaha versus the muhaddithin approach. Number four is that most canonical works of hadith were written for the ulamas and the scholars, not for the lay people. So when Imam Bukhari rahmatullahi was compiling his Sahih, when Imam Muslim rahmatullahi was compiling his Sahih, like as many other great muhaddithin, when they were compiling their own canonical work hadith, they were doing it primarily for the scholars and the students of deen, not necessarily for the lay people. So reading the works was not for the hadith itself, but understanding the author's methodological criteria. So when you're studying hadith, Sahih Bukhari, for example, then we're understanding Imam Bukhari rahmatullah's methodology. We are understanding his fiqh and his methodological criteria. How does he apply his criteria to the hadith? Like as Imam Muslim rahmatullahi, like as Imam Tirmizi rahmatullahi. So we have to understand the author methodological criteria because they all work within a certain, because they all adopt a certain framework. So one cannot just expect to understand the hadith by simply reading the translation, or if somebody just knows Arabic language, or just study at face value. It doesn't work like that. But otherwise, the composition of detailed commentaries with scholarly differences would not have existed in the first place. Because if it was so simple to understand, there will be no need for detailed commentaries or voluminous works on these particular subjects. So that itself, it shows and it illustrates that that these works were written by ulamas and scholars, and it's not for any lay person just to pick up Sahih Bukhari, for example, and start studying themselves. That's number four. Number five is that authentic hadith are not just confined to Bukhari and Muslim, despite both ranking the highest in their status, okay, due to the acceptance of the ummah and the stringent criteria in accepting or rejecting a hadith. That's a key point here, is that even though that Bukhari and Muslim are ranked as the highest in authenticity, but it doesn't mean that authentic hadith does not fall outside of their books. That doesn't mean that, because there are many many sahih hadith that are included in other works which are not included in Bukhari and Muslim. So most scholars only included a small fraction of the ahadith in their major collections, from the vast encyclopedic ahadith they had memorized, reaching to hundreds of thousands. So, for example, Sahih Bukhari, for example, right, with repetition, it contains about just over 7,000 hadith, between 7 to 8,000 hadith. Imam Bukhari rahmatullahi has known to memorize no less than 300,000. He memorized no less than 300,000 hadith with the chain of sanad, and from that he only included approximately about between 7 to 8,000 hadith. That's a very tiny percentage. And Imam Bukhari rahmatullahi himself mentioned that there are many strong ahadith, there are many sahih ahadith that which I've not included in my sahih collection. Yes, and likewise, for example, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal rahmatullahi alayhi, in his Musnad, some people have said that he's included 17,000 hadith, some say 20,000 hadith, whichever way, but that's only a small percentage compared to the hundreds and 300,000 hadith of which he had memorized. Yes. So this is something to understand. So it indicates that the authentic hadith could potentially exist outside of their compendium, and therefore we should not be confused with the fact that Sahih Hadith only contains in these two books. Now, point number 6 is that except for Imam Abu Dawud and Imam Muslim rahmatullahi, most Hadith scholars did not explicate their conditions of accepting or rejecting Hadith. Okay, they do not explicate their criteria or conditions of accepting or rejecting a Hadith. So, as a result, the Hadith specialists that came after in the subsequent generations, they deduced the accreditation and rejection criteria after meticulous study of their work. So what that means is that many of the hadith, for example, Imam Abu Dawud rahmatullahi, Imam Tirmizi rahmatullahi alayhi, for example, okay, right? Maybe Imam Tirmizi rahmatullahi when he wrote his Kitab al-Ilal, but if you read the commentaries, you notice that the ulamas and scholars, they differ as to whether this was their particular criteria or not. So because they do not explicate, I use the word explicate is because in some places they've explicated, some places they have not explicated, which led to the ulamas of the future generation, after meticulously studying their works, they then deduced from their works or indications of whether of the conditions of whether of a hadith being sahih or whether it being da'if. That's point number 6. And finally, point number 7, that the development of hadith science is an ongoing process even till today. So therefore, we should appreciate the complexity of the science, and we appreciate and accommodate the existing scholarly differences. So whenever there's scholarly differences between ulamas and scholars, we should appreciate those diversity, because there's a lot of diversity. So mainly the main conclusion of this session is that we need to appreciate the diversity and diversity or the diverse views of scholars in this particular subject in of itself. And when we know, and when somebody says to you that this hadith is sahih or this hadith is da'if, then the question we should ask is, according to who? That this is sahih according to who? This is da'if according to who? What's their understanding and definition of sahih and da'if? Why have they categorize this hadith as sahih and da'if? What is the methodological criteria? What is the approach, etc.? So these are the questions that we should always ask before we begin to take before we take somebody's word for it. So hope this benefited. Jazakumullahu khair. And once again, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you found this video beneficial. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.